Hello, welcome to week 3 of ResearchMD. My goal is to explain scientific articles to ordinary people so that they can be empowered to know how to read science papers. Um, and because they're just so interesting. So today we're going to talk about an article from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Can drinking alcohol for those people with heart disease or other cardiovascular issues kind of decrease death from cardiovascular issues or just death overall? This is a paper by Dr. Costanzo and team, and they do a meta-analysis. I talk about this in my prior videos, but basically meta-analysis is the highest form of research because it compiles a lot of studies done on whatever topic, and it kind of gives you like a summary value based on all the results. So how do they do this? So they searched articles from PubMed and Embase. Basically, this is like a Google of scholarly papers all the way through October 2009. And they say all these studies were prospective. What that basically means, these studies weren't like, I'm going to choose a group of people and I'm going to randomize you drink this much alcohol, you drink this much alcohol, and you don't drink this alcohol. No, they didn't randomize. Basically, they looked at people who have cardiovascular disease, and then they followed them over time and just see if they died from cardiovascular disease or if they died from just overall health problems. And then they saw whether, how much alcohol they drank based on like surveys that they received. And then the data were pulled with a weighted least squares regression analysis. I don't want you to get afraid. So basically this means is you have a lot of data points, right? So this kind of formula technique method is based on each data point, you try to find a line of best fit. So that's basically what it means. So this meta-analysis showed a J-shaped pool curve. What does that mean? So say this is your y-axis on a graph, and this is your x-axis. The higher up it is, let's say you have a worse health outcome. And the x is how much beer or alcohol you drink, from 0 to 20. So a J-curve is something like this. Basically, at a certain point, drinking alcohol is good for you, but then at another point, it's really bad for you. And you might know people who have cirrhosis because they drink a lot of alcohol. And so, in conclusion, they found that patients with cardiovascular disease, light to moderate alcohol consumption, they define it as 5 to 25 grams per day, was significantly associated with a lower incidence of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality/death. What is 5 to 25 grams of alcohol? I didn't know that. So a can of beer, give or take, is around 14 grams of alcohol. So just for your reference. So this meta-analysis is not a new one. Basically, they extended it from Dr. Istra and team because they noticed that there were new studies that have been published on alcohol and cardiovascular and overall death. So they included those new studies that Dr. Istra and team did not include. Basically, they found 54 articles that they believed might meet their criteria. And overall, they had 2 people in the team independently review it. And overall, 8 studies were selected. And it's important that 2 people independently do it just because, as researchers, we want to get published. That's our way to kind of get famous, leave our legacy. And if you just do it by yourself, you might not even know it, but you might get biased and say you might cherry pick some articles that might influence whether how important the findings are. And then basically they try to find studies that examined patients who had a cardiovascular disease, including the heart, including stroke, including clogged heart arteries. And then they also try to find if these studies measured within those patients with cardiovascular disease, if they died from cardiovascular like cardiovascular issues such as a heart attack, stroke, or if they measured just whether when they died and what they die of, not only just cardiovascular issues. Here are the 8 studies that they characterize. It's nice. It's important for researchers, for us to be transparent, just so everyone can see what he or she and the team did. So follow-up. So these studies were prospective studies. They found these patients with cardiovascular disease, and they just kept on following up with them and assessed whether any of them died from cardiovascular disease, or just whether they died and from what cause. And so the first study in Sweden, they followed the patients up for 8.6 years. And then N basically refers to number, like number of participants. And that Sweden study had 1,332. No, I'm sorry. Primary event is basically whether the study picked patients who had cardiovascular disease. And in this case, the Sweden study, it was patients with a heart attack. The other studies looked at patients who had a stroke. Secondary event is whether the study examined if the patients who had cardiovascular disease, if they died from cardiovascular causes, or just died, if they measured whether they died and how come they died. And questionnaire administered, A and B. If you look to the bottom, A and B refers to when a questionnaire was administered. Why would you want to administer it? Just to ask them, like, how often do you drink alcohol? So A was, when the patient that was studied had a heart attack, had a stroke, or had clogged heart arteries, they asked them a few days after, how much alcohol do you typically drink? Whereas B was after they had their initial cardiovascular disease. They asked them several months later. And that's important because sometimes we might just not remember as well. Maybe we're a little bit scared after a couple of months. Or maybe we're a little bit scared after a couple of days because it just happened. And we might overemphasize, I drank a lot, or maybe some people will underemphasize, I didn't drink at all, but I still had this heart attack. So that's why they mentioned this part. And then former drinkers in reference groups. So basically, these studies also had people who didn't drink. But the question is, there are people who don't drink now, but may have drank in the past, versus people who just never drank ever. So that's what they're talking about here. So they performed 2 meta-analyses. Remember, the primary outcome was looking for if these studies looked for patients with cardiovascular disease. And then the secondary outcomes were 1, if they died from cardiovascular disease. And then 2 was if the study recorded whether they just died from any cause. So that's what they studied, if drinking alcohol can reduce death by cardiovascular disease, and or if drinking alcohol can reduce just all kinds of health-related death. So that's what they're talking about for those 2 meta-analysis. Now, data analysis. This is the part that always confuses me, and I'm all about big picture, and I just want you to take away the big picture here. So let's go for it. Data analysis, number 1. So basically, for each of the 8 studies, you have a number of patients drink a certain grams of alcohol per day. So basically, they're just trying to find a midpoint. And then number 2, just like more information, statistics used to kind of help create a graph, help to summarize and add up each of the 8 studies. Number 3 are just like controls. They gathered, the gender of this patient, whether they were completely abstinent or just former drinkers. Factors like that. And then they talk about inverse variance weighted methods. Basically, that's just saying, there's just kind of combining the variation within each of the 8 studies. because overall meta-analysis is trying to combine all these data, right? Just to make a final overall summary statement. And then fractional polynomial curves of the second order, please do not turn this video off. It's not as bad as in middle school or high school when we learned this. Basically, big picture is, remember the J-shaped curve, right? That's not a linear, it's not a straight line. It's like that's why they're including polynomials. Basically, they're trying to find an equation that kind of accounts for that shape. They talk about random and fixed solutions. And I just want to talk about big picture. You have 8 studies. Do you weigh them equally, or do you give each of the studies different weights? For example, a study that has hypothetically 1,000 patients versus a study that has 2 patients. Do you give them equal weight when you combine it for the meta-analysis? No. And so fixed and random are different ways to account for the weighting of each study when you add them. So that's what they did. So random is basically you account for variability within each of the 8 studies, boys, girls, older, younger, educated, not educated, but also study variation between each study. Questionnaire within 2 days, questionnaire within 2 months. Excuse me. And then fixed solution is just you only account for variability within each study, and you assume that the variability between each study, you don't take that into account. So the analysis they did, they excluded 1 study at a time, and they found the random and fixed methods. And if they removed that 1 study and then they included it, and the difference between the random and fixed was just huge, astronomical, they eliminated that study. Okay, and then they talk about publication bias. Basically, for researchers, we want to leave our markings and publish in a journal, but the publishers, they also want to find some interesting findings, right? So there's this phenomenon where publishers will only publish data that's like interesting. If that's the case, there can be a bias, and a way to determine that bias is like a graph we call a funnel plot. So just big picture, imagine a funnel and just flip it on its side, so it's the narrow part and then the wide part, right? So if, let's say, you have all these studies and their results are, alcohol, moderate amounts of alcohol are good for your heart health for those who have heart disease, and then it's not good for your heart health if you have heart disease. If it's biased, all those studies would kind of just be here. It would be half a funnel. But if there were results that said, we also found that it's kind of good for your, or it's not good for your health, then some data points will be here, and some data points will be here, and it'll look like a funnel. So that's my example. They give a funnel plot, and basically you have a statistic, like a test to examine this, and they didn't find any evidence of publication bias. So this is the meat of the paper. This is that J curve. I know it doesn't really look like a J, but use your imagination. So what's important? So the y-axis right here, the vertical part, it's called relative risk of cardiovascular or all-cause mortality. Remember, they did 2 meta-analyses, right? People with cardiovascular disease, then they measured if those people died from heart disease or cardiovascular disease, or if they just died overall. And so the red is those patients, the studies that examined just death overall, and the black lines represent people who just died from cardiovascular, or just takes into account people who died from cardiovascular disease. So relative risk, basically, I just want you to know just a couple of numbers, and then you'll be set. 1 is there's no difference in risk. It doesn't matter if you drink or don't drink alcohol. It has no effect on your mortality. So basically, and the x-axis is how much alcohol you drink, and you can see at like around 24, 25, give or take, there's no protection because it crosses 1 at that point. And then for relative risk, the lower the number in this situation, the more benefit you get in reducing cardiovascular death and just death overall. So you can see here around give or take 5 through 7-ish is kind of like the lowest point. And so here at this point, drinking this amount of alcohol per day, 6-7 grams per day, maybe like a third of a can of beer, is really does reduce the risk of cardiovascular death and just death overall in this study. So, and it just seems here comparing the red to the black, comparing all-cause mortality with just cardiovascular mortality, seems like it has a greater effect on cardiovascular mortality, just because the black line is lower than the red line. So study limitations. One, it's not a randomized control trial. Basically, that's like really important for researchers, because you kind of control any different factors. So for example, there are tall boys and girls and short boys and girls. If you don't randomize, there might be a chance one group is just all tall and one group will be all short. If you randomize, if you have a decent amount of people in the study, it's you're going to have an equal amount of tall boys and girls and short boys and girls within each group. Another limitation is a small number of studies. It was 8, so they're acknowledging that. And then the other one is some of the studies they were saying it's hard to separate the former smokers from those who are former drinkers from those who never drank at all, because perhaps their questionnaire never asked that question. And so going back to the conclusion again, drinking 5 to 25 grams was significantly associated with a lower incidence of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. And y'all know, because you know how to read this paper, that if you can choose an amount, you would probably choose around 5 grams, just because that part is the lowest in this J-curve graph. And lastly, we always want to know an explanation, right? Like, why can that reduce cardiovascular or just overall death? Because it regulates lipids well at a certain point. It decreased platelet, the stickiness and it attaching to our vessels to a certain point. And it's good for reduces inflammation, and it makes our cells more sensitive to insulin to a certain point. So bottom line, if you're going to drink, they're saying drink a moderate amount, 5 to 25 grams, but you also have to lead a healthy lifestyle as well. Our body is just so complex. We can't just focus on one factor. We got to exercise, watch our diet. We try to be mentally and physically healthy as well. So I hope this, kind of clarifies and makes things a little bit easier. And I look forward to seeing you all next week. Take care.